address some myths that people have about what it means to have a diagnosis called psychopathy, and help you understand why this is actually something as a society we should really pay attention to, because how we legally handle these individuals is one that, quite frankly, violates constitutional rights. So when I say the term psychopath, have any of you heard that term before? What comes to mind when you hear the term psychopath? Just yell it out.
Crazy. Individual who, although calm, may have ill intent.
Okay, so I heard crazy. That was the loudest one I heard. I heard they might seem calm, but they actually do difficult or harmful things. I think that perfectly captures how we understand individuals with psychopathy. They have long captured the imagination because the crimes they commit are so vicious that we are trying to understand how can someone do that. Yet they also are extremely charming and can swindle people or take money from people and convince people to do things that they might not normally. They're now all over TV and news programs, and so today my goal is to bring you inside their mind, clear up some myths that have led to a stunting of progress of how we handle these individuals in the criminal legal system. So people with psychopathy are represented as about 1% of the general population, which is a similar rate to other psychiatric diagnoses like schizophrenia. But within the legal system, they represent about 25% of currently incarcerated individuals. Part of the reason why they get so much attention is because people with psychopathy commit more crimes and more types of crimes, meaning that they're committing not just theft, but theft, drug crimes, assault, murder. So they kind of do it all when it comes to crimes at a higher rate than other individuals. They also recidivate or recommit crimes after being released at a higher rate and much faster than other individuals. They tend to use lots of substances when they are very young, continuing throughout their lifespan. And because of these factors, they disproportionately account for the cost of crime, not only in the United States, but internationally. So if they are caught, they often are sentenced to long and harsh sentences, and they often are referred to treatments, but the current treatments we give them within the legal system are ineffective, just compounding the cost. And currently, our way of handling individuals with psychopathy is one that really focuses on harsh punishment. Again, because of the reasons you all said, because they're perceived as crazy, because they're perceived as doing these really mean and evil things that must be addressed by locking them up and throwing away the key. But that particular stance is one that is rooted in an unscientific understanding of why they do what they do. We are assuming that they are rational actors, or what in the law we call that they have culpability for their crime. But what I'd like to walk through today is some scientific work that suggests that they might not have full capacity to rationally understand everything they're doing. Therefore, we should treat them like we would other forms of serious mental illness in the law, which is route them to more forensic mental health centers or treatment facilities rather than incarcerate them for life, or in the United States, often individuals with psychopathy are disproportionately given the death penalty as a sentence if they come up for a murder charge. So perhaps the one fact that people think really explains why people with psychopathy do what they do is because they're fearless. So fear is one of the most fundamental emotions that we have, and it often helps us from doing things that are really out of control, that might put us in a vulnerable situation, or might get us in trouble. So why do you follow your parents' rules? Your fear of being punished. Okay, hold on. Consequences, exactly. The original theories of psychopathy suggest that why they do what they do is because they don't have that internal fear. They're not afraid of consequences, and if there is a consequence, they don't learn from that punishment. And that has really solidified a legal understanding of these individuals, and it can be framed in this particular quote from a clinical psychologist. For them, fear, like most other emotions, is incomplete, shallow, largely cognitive in nature, meaning they might know what fear is, but they don't feel it, and without physiological turmoil or the coloring that most of us find unpleasant and wish to avoid or reduce. So how is it that the individual with psychopathy can steal from their friend or their mother? Because they're unafraid. They're unafraid of the consequence, and they're unafraid of what might happen to them. And there's lots of research to support this particular view of psychopathy, that they don't experience fear and they don't learn from punishment. And most of that work is focused on a region of the brain called the amygdala. So the amygdala is a part of our brain that's deep within our brain, and it's very fundamental to being able to process and react to emotional information, particularly fear. And what early research suggests is that individuals with psychopathy show decreased size in their amygdala, which generally is a reflection of poorer amygdala health, less activity in the amygdala, suggesting it's not reacting to information as much, and less connectivity between the amygdala and other parts of the brain. Meaning if their amygdala is reacting, it's not communicating that information neurally to other parts of the brain. So the rest of the brain is not being informed of that information. And this has really dominated the view of psychopathic individuals. A key problem with this assumption, though, is if you have fundamentally a smaller and less active amygdala, there's very little we can do about it. There's no treatment that can grow your amygdala or change the amygdala's reactivity. But if we take the scientific route to try and understand, is this really true? Is it that they cannot experience fear at all, that their amygdalas are fundamentally broken? That is a challenge to this misperception. And it's this type of work that, again, has reinforced the idea that people with psychopathy should be locked up because the most fundamental part of the brain is just broken, essentially. And so what we did was try and challenge this idea. On the one hand, are individuals with psychopathy completely incapable of experiencing fear? Or on the other hand, can they experience it, but it's just much harder? Scientifically, we don't know. So what we did is what's called an instructed fear conditioning paradigm, where people are shown red and green colored letters, and then an electric shock that's not painful, but is just unpleasant, is administered to their fingers. Only though with some red letters. So red means threat, green means totally safe, okay? And what we do is we can show these letters, and on some letters play this really loud noise over headphones called a startle probe. So most of you will listen to your music at about 60 to 80 decibels. This startle probe is 102 decibels, so it's really loud but really brief. And what it does is it allows us to measure this, which is called the orbicularis oculi muscle. It's right under your eye, and it twitches to a greater magnitude when you're afraid than when you're feeling safe. So when you're watching a really scary movie and the room is dark and someone sneaks up behind you, you're going to jump out of your chair. And your orbicularis oculi muscle is going to twitch to a huge magnitude. But if you're watching a comedy and someone sneaks up behind you, you might be a little bit scared, but not as much as the context of being afraid. And so we can measure this without any invasiveness by just putting sensors under people's eyes. And the blink magnitude to this loud noise probe can be measured by looking at how much did that startle response go up when there were red letters versus when there were green letters. And this particular measure is an indirect measure of amygdala reactivity. So what we did is we had these different conditions where sometimes people were focused directly on the threatening information. And all you have to do is say if it's threat or safe. So again, threat focus, is it threat or safe? Pretty easy. If you see a red letter, it's threat, green letter, it's safe. Then we had other conditions where the letters are still red and green. Green means you're safe still, and red means there's a chance of shock still. And don't worry, we didn't, rig the chairs that you're sitting on to shock you. But that would give you a sense. If I scare you right now, you'd be really scared. Your orbicularis oculi muscle would be quite active. And so in this condition, now I don't want you to tell me about the letter color, but whether the letter is upper or lowercase. So say it along. When you see a letter, just say upper or lower.
Upper, lower, lower.
Exactly. So why this is important, super easy to do. You're focused on upper or lowercase, but the color of the letter is still going to create a context that you have to pay attention to about whether there's a chance of shock or not. So even if you see a lowercase letter, if that's red, you might be like, holy crap, I'm about to get shocked. But if it's green, you're like, phew, lower, I feel fine. We also can create a little bit more of a difficult task where you have to match the letter on the screen to one presented to previously, and it puts more cognitive demand. And the whole goal, again, of these particular trials is to say, if you focus them on threat, can they respond? Versus focusing them on something else, and threat is contextual. How do they respond? So how do we look at this? Well, we do a life history interview that's about 3 hours long, where we ask people almost everything we could think about their lives. Education, work history, family history, relationships, crimes they've committed, how they feel about feelings. And we then score that interview on this standardized scale that gives us a psychopathy score between 0 and 40. Most people who are diagnosed with psychopathy will have a score of 30 or above, so right here. The average person walking around scores about a 6. So these are people who are really extreme on this scale. And then we can measure on what's called the y-axis, this startle response to the red, threat, versus green, safe, in all of these conditions. So, focusing first on the red line, this is that threat-focused condition where I'm supposed to ask you, just tell me, is this threatening or safe? And we could see that even if you're not used to looking at graphs, just follow along with me. We could see that people who are low on psychopathy are at the same level as the people who are high on psychopathy, meaning that they respond similarly. Does everyone see it that way? Great. But let's look at the blue lines, those conditions that are always upper or lower or matching the letters on the screen to the two previously. We see that people low in psychopathy still have a pretty strong startle response. So they're still reacting to that upper, lowercase, and color information. But the people high in psychopathy show a deficit in startle. They are so focused on whether the case is upper or lower that they're not processing the color. They no longer are paying attention to whether the color of the letter is red, threat, or green, safe. Make sense? Okay. So what this suggests then is that individuals with psychopathy are capable of experiencing fear. You see that in the red line here. But when fear is contextual, when it's not the focus of their attention, they show a deficit in processing it. That's this part right here. And we've replicated this in multiple studies. We even put an MRI scanner on the back of a truck and drove it into a prison and scanned people's brains in the prison on this task and see the exact same thing by measuring the amygdala more directly. Because remember I said that startle is an indirect measure of amygdala activity. So I could show this effect with the brains of individuals with psychopathy directly through MRI as well. So why is this important? Well, it's important because it suggests that they're not fundamentally incapable of experiencing fear. Our legal standard that they need to be locked up because they are evil, they are incapable of this basic emotion, is not supported by the science. It doesn't mean that it's easy for them to feel fear, but the fact that they have some capability to experience it means that there might be ways to leverage interventions to target their capability rather than seeing them as purely incapable. Another myth about individuals with psychopathy is that they can't experience regret. And when people go to prison or they're on trial, one of the most fundamental features that judges, juries, and lawyers look for is that someone feels badly about what happened. They feel badly about what they did and the consequences. So let's say someone's incarcerated and they're coming up for parole, meaning they're going to be released but on some amount of supervision. They are asked explicitly about whether they feel badly or regret for what they did. Now, you could say yes to that, but whether you really feel it or not might be something different. And individuals with psychopathy are notorious for not feeling regret. There are quotes about it that they generally lack concern for the negative consequences of their actions, both criminal and non-criminal. They're more concerned with the effects on themselves. And so this type of feature, this is part of almost the diagnosis of psychopathy, is another reason why individuals with psychopathy are not only sentenced harshly from the beginning, but are kept in prison much longer than anyone else, certainly anyone else with a diagnosable mental health problem. But scientifically, we actually can measure regret in multiple ways. Just like I told you, we can measure fear in multiple ways. It's not as simple as how we talk about fear day to day. So there are two types of regret from a decision science perspective. One is what we usually focus on, which is retrospective regret. when you found out that you could have done something better or differently. So you find out if you win or lose, and then you think back, oh, if I just picked that other thing, or if I just did that other thing, I could have done something differently and won more. That's what we call retrospective regret. And this part of regret is supported by regions of the brain like the amygdala. And this is typically what we think about clinically when you look back that someone feels badly. That's different than what we call prospective regret, which is when you feel regret, do you use that information to change your behavior moving forward? And this is something that we actually measure using a different part of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is more in the frontal part of your brain. So from a basic day-to-day or colloquial sense, we think about regret as this kind of monolithic one thing. You find out your outcome and you feel something. But from a scientific perspective, we can actually dissociate different components of regret. And this might be meaningful for thinking about, again, do these individuals who commit really heinous crimes and account for a lot of the cost of crime fundamentally not feel regret? And if they do, just like with fear, we need to have a proportionate consequence. But if they don't feel, regret, we have to have a proportionate consequence. If they do feel regret, then that's some signal that we can do something to alter their behavior and that we legally should not be punishing them as harshly. So how do we measure this in the lab? Well, we play a very simple game where you're asked to pick one of two circles and a ball will randomly bounce around and tell you how many points you won or lost. And I'm going to ask you how you feel about that, disappointed or pleased. Then you find out how much you would have won if you picked the other circle. So let's look at that again. You pick this circle, you win 70 points randomly. You feel pretty good because you could have lost 210 points. Bless you. But then you find out that you could have lost 70 points, so you're feeling really good at that point. And we ask you to do this 80 times. And what we can do is measure how you feel on those questions. That's going to be the retrospective regret measures, how you feel once you find out the outcome. And I can take the information on the screen with your feelings rating and try and predict what you'll do on the next trial. That's prospective regret. So what do we see? First, when you just see the 70, people with psychopathy, this is going to now be the red line, are rating similarly to people low on psychopathy, the blue line. So you see there's almost complete overlap. So this means that when they find out their outcome, they can report how they feel. Just like in the threat focus condition, when we asked them to say, was this a threatening letter or not, red or green, they were able to respond to that. When we ask them, how do you feel when you find out that you won 70 points, but you could have lost 70 points, or some version of that, they actually feel a lot of feelings about that. They can report, again, I feel really happy or I feel really disappointed when they find out their outcome. So inconsistent with the clinical observation, from a neuroscientific and psychological science perspective, we actually see that people with psychopathy are able to report feeling regret. When they find out their outcome, they report having regret. The question is, do they do anything with that feeling? So on the x-axis, what I'm going to show you is basically a measure of that experience of regret. And on the y-axis right here, I'm going to show you the prediction of what they'll do on the next trial. And so if you all are responding based on your feelings of regret, there should be some modulation, meaning that the line should go up and down. Okay? So looking at the low line first, the blue line, people with psychopathy, depending on their feeling of regret, their line goes up and down. That's what we expect. So based on what they won or lost, we can use that signal of how they feel to predict their next trial. But people high on psychopathy, the red line, essentially show a completely flat line. It doesn't matter how they felt. It's not changing their behavior for what they do on the next trial. So even though in the moment they could tell you something is threatening or I feel regret, they're not using that information to inform their future behavior. And we can use this type of data, which we have in our lab, to then say, okay, well, people high on psychopathy and who have this kind of low regret, of prospective regret signal, what does that mean then for their real world behavior? Well, the combination of being high on psychopathy and showing less prospective regret predicts the number of incarcerations that they have. So meaning that this type of psychological phenomenon and having this diagnosis is directly related to perhaps not learning from this incarceration or punishment experience. They continue to do the behaviors that end them up in this really problematic context. But it's not because they're inherently evil, or it's not because they don't feel regret at all. I showed you on previous slides that they do. But it's because there's a disconnect between what they reported feeling and whether they use that for their future behavior. That's very different than fundamental incapability. The next myth that, again, contributes to harsh sentences and locking people with psychopathia actually is one that they can take the perspective of other people. How can people with psychopathy con good people out of their money? Well, it's because they're able to read your mind and take your perspective. They know what you want, what you care about, and they're going to sweet talk you until they get what they want from you. And there's some scientific data to suggest that they actually are capable of taking other people's perspective. You're going to notice a theme here, which is just because what we observe in the real world seems right does not mean it's supported by science. So even though they might be able to take people's perspective, the question is, do they always, and do they do it easily? This type of myth is one that perpetuates them as these kind of like slimy cons that you can't trust no matter what they do. And that fundamentally, from a psychological perspective, they're doing it intentionally. And we can see this in classic observations, where the psychopath is characterized by an insufficiency of integrative processes that causes him to remain oblivious to the drawbacks or complications that would give others pause, and might give him pause as well. So how do we typically measure this in the lab? Well, what most people do is they play these vignette games where they tell a story, like a story about Sally Ann. Sally Ann is in the kitchen, and she really wants a cookie, but her mom says you can't have a cookie right now. So the mom puts the jar of cookies into the top of the cupboard. In that instance, does Sally Ann know where the cookies are? She's standing in the kitchen with her mom. Yes. Now Sally Ann is in the kitchen and she really wants a cookie. And she has a tantrum and she runs out. And while she's out of the room, in the living room, her mom moves the cookie jar. Does Sally Ann know where the cookies are now?
No.
No. And so the way we typically have measured this is just what I did with you, asking directly, does the character in the story know what's happening? It's a very direct response, okay? Like regret and like with fear, though, if we really want to take a nuanced perspective of how the brains and minds work of individuals, we have to separate out different cognitive phenomena. So from a clinical and cognitive neuroscience perspective, we actually can measure regret and perspective taking in two different ways. One is called controlled or deliberate perspective taking, and that is just what I asked you to do, which is deliberately taking the perspective of the character, telling a story, asking you, what does this character know? The other is what we call automatic perspective taking. This is something that actually didn't start developing when you're a baby. And this is having other people's perspective effortlessly affect your own. So your job is not to deliberately take someone's perspective, but given that we're social beings, how people are responding can influence how you're responding. So right in this moment, no one told me I have to take your perspective. But when I ask you questions and people are nodding along or people seem confused, I might adjust what I'm saying. No one told me to do that, but given, again, that we're social and we want to connect and have people try to understand, we modulate what we do based on the feedback that we're getting. And this begins in early weeks of brain development to develop throughout the life course. So given this definition, we can actually manipulate this in the lab. So we can have a task that is called the controlled perspective taking task. And so in this task, you're supposed to take the perspective of the avatar. In this case, this study was run in all men. And so it always starts by telling the participant to take his perspective. Then you're shown a number, and the question is, yes or no, does he, the avatar, see a total of 2 red dots? So yes or no, does he see 2 red dots? Yes. Okay. I realize it's a little hard to see on this screen, but you're correct. Yes, he does. So every single child in this condition, you're taking the perspective of the avatar. And this avatar looked like the person who was playing the game. So they were wearing the same type of outfits that the people in this prison were wearing. They were matched on race and ethnicity. They were matched on hair color, because all of those things tend to influence how much we take people's perspective. So they felt like they were playing against someone like them, basically. Then there's an automatic condition. Now I want you all to take your perspective. Forget the avatar for a second. Can you, from your perspective, see a total of 2 dots, yes or no?
Yes.
Exactly. But you all did this perfectly. So you all can see a total of 3 dots, 2 here and 1 here. But the avatar can see a total of 2 dots. So over time, we get more and more accurate. We end up doing pretty well, but we're much slower in this condition. So it's not generally about accuracy, but about slowness. Because your perspective conflicts with the avatar's perspective, we just slow down a little bit. And it usually takes us a few trials to kind of get it right. Make sense? Okay. So again, what the literature would suggest that supports a lot of the legal decisions on sentencing for people with psychopathy is that they are so good at taking your perspective that they need to be found at fault for all the crimes they do. It's so intentional. What we end up seeing, so this is that same interview score on the x-axis, and this is basically a reaction time measure that says how quickly were you at responding to the doc question in the different conditions. Controlled is that deliberate condition. So much like with the startle response, we see that people low on psychopathy and high on psychopathy are showing similar types of perspective taking. This is what the literature has supported. When you ask people with psychopathy to deliberately take someone's perspective, they can do it. But we want to focus on this blue line. So looking down here, we see that people first who are low on psychopathy are still showing some interference even when they're taking their own perspective. Like they still care, like a lot of you did, about what the avatar sees. But people high on psychopathy show much less and significantly less interference, meaning they don't care at all what the avatar sees. They are just so focused on what they see that their brains effectively don't process at all what the avatar sees. Again, this is something that begins to develop in infancy, so it's not something you deliberately can do or not. This is just how your brain is processing information. So they fundamentally are not really able to take in all the contextual information in their environment, and it might lead them to engage in types of behaviors that seem callous and cold and uncaring about the other person. But what these data suggest is that they're actually just not processing what the other person sees, much like they weren't processing the fear information when it wasn't the focus of their attention. Why is this meaningful? Because this particular effect, so if I take this type of information and I say who is most likely to engage in an assault crime, punch or harm someone, it's the people who are high on psychopathy and who showed this interference, less interference, who committed the most number of assault crimes. Okay. So what we have gone through so far is that you all started by saying that people with psychopathy are crazy, they do fit a clinical diagnosis, that they're evil, that they're controlled, and that is also consistent with the lay public's perception of people with psychopathy. And for a long time, the science was so focused on fitting that view that legally what that translated to was really harsh punishments for these individuals. We have no evidence that those harsh punishments actually ended up working. In fact, the evidence seems to suggest that they just stay in prison, get released, commit more crimes at a higher and faster rate, and go back in prison, costing society a lot of money and a lot of suffering. And what the data that I've shown you so far suggests is that our scientific understanding does not match the legal actions that we're handling these individuals with. It's not that they're fundamentally incapable of experiencing fear. They can do it, it's just hard when fear is not the main focus of their attention. It's not that they can't experience regret, it's that they can't do it unless it's their focus and they use that information to inform later behavior. And it's not that they're intentionally just trying to use your perspective and take you for all the money you have, but it's that they really struggle to integrate at a neural level the type of information that the rest of us might be integrating more naturally. So, just from a legal perspective, we would say that there is no clear scientific evidence that they are intentionally and rationally engaging. What all the data suggests, highlights for you, is that there's actually some fundamental, and from a legal perspective, we call it a brain defect that influences how they perceive and incorporate information. Which again, does not mean that they should just be let free, but it means that they're less culpable of their actions. The last and perhaps most difficult myth that we've ever had to deal with that really supports from a legal perspective why ultimately, even if I convince people of everything I just told you, that they end up being sent to prison for long sentences, is the belief that people with psychopathy are fundamentally unchangeable. And there's some data to suggest this. So individuals with psychopathy are often perceived as unchangeable because there's evidence to suggest that they don't respond to treatment. There's evidence to suggest that when you give them the typical treatments that are given in prison, they get better at being psychopaths, which is usually not our goal. When you tell them, how do you focus on emotion, they use that to then con people more. They drop out of treatment faster than other people. So there really is some support out there that would say, okay, well, there's really nothing we can do with them. And this is compounded by the types of myths that I highlighted for you, which is that they have parts of their brain, like the amygdala, that are really not functioning in typical ways that are very hard to change. But I also highlighted for you there's more nuance in our understanding now that the science has gotten better. Individuals with psychopathy actually can experience emotion if you make it the focus of their attention. Let's just pause and think. How many times a day do you think you walk around focusing 100% on your emotion? Never. But, like, I can think of a couple of situations. Or maybe if you're in therapy and your therapist asks, how do you feel? Then you focus on your emotion. But more often than not, emotions are contextual. Like, I'm walking around, you might not have been outside yet, but it's snowing pretty heavily right now. So if you're walking around, I'm so focused on coming here, but it's really slippery. I might feel like a pit in my stomach, maybe suggesting that I'm nervous, that I'm going to slip and fall. And so that might lead me to slow down a little bit. That is typically how we use emotion. What is something you're afraid of? Anyone?
Spiders.
Spiders, that's a very common one. So you're walking around day to day. How do you know to avoid a spider? What do you feel?
Scared.
How do you know you're scared?
Like, I tremble.
You tremble, yep. And then what do you do?
Run.
Back away, exactly, or run away or scream or whatever it might be. So, those are all cues that you're going to use to change your behavior. But do you walk around trembling, running, and finding spiders every day, all the time, focusing just on the spiders? No. So, the fact that we all can understand that emotions are not something that we focus on, but color what we do, is important. Because what I showed you is that actually people with psychopathy can feel the emotion. What doesn't happen is they don't have emotions naturally kind of coloring what they do without some deliberate intent. That's something we can focus on, though, from a clinical perspective. We can help them focus on their emotion more. I also highlighted for you that individuals with psychopathy seem to have difficulty integrating context. And I didn't go into it today, but we've been able to identify a very specific attention abnormality that's rooted in a part of the brain that makes it so that they are so focused on their goal. It's almost like they have a magnifying glass on their goal, and so that everything else around it is blurry. And because of that, It makes it hard to integrate things like emotion, other people's feelings, consequences. So there's a great documentary on HBO about Robert Durst. Does anyone know who that is? Okay, so Robert Durst came from a very, very wealthy real estate family in New York City. And he was on the run for potentially murdering his landlord. And this man is already on the run from the police. He drives up to a Wegmans, which is a grocery store, and he goes into the Wegmans and he steals a hoagie. How much do you think the sandwich cost? Yeah, $7, $8. They catch him for stealing the hoagie, and they open his car, and he has $250,000 in his car, and they find like $700 in his pocket. And the question that is asked during the documentary is, why would a man on the run from the police with $250,000 in the car and $700 in his pocket go into the Wegmans and steal a sandwich? Like, it makes no sense. If you're going to kill someone, which you probably shouldn't do in the first place, don't then go get caught from stealing a hoagie. Like, that makes truly no sense. But if it's so nonsensical, then it helps us think, okay, well, is there a reason that would happen? And that's the type of attention abnormality that becomes really problematic for people with psychopathy. All he wanted in that moment was that hoagie, for whatever reason. So he focused so intently on that, he forgot about being on the run. He didn't integrate the potential consequence of getting caught or seeing even the cameras that were in the room. Those are the types of behaviors that we just shake our head and say, why would anyone do this? Well, there's actually a brain abnormality that can explain it. The issue with psychopathy that makes it hard for us to understand is that sometimes that abnormality actually confers an advantage for them, like in the perspective-taking test. The fact that they could ignore the perspective of the avatar means that they could just focus on their goal. But in other times, it can be a disadvantage, like not noticing the consequences in Robert Durst's case, for example. And all of that together is something that we could use as information to actually develop a new treatment. I know how, from a clinical perspective, to help people experience emotions more and to integrate that into their attention and behavior. But it's not the traditional therapy. It's not just sitting and talking and asking people how they feel or challenging their thoughts, which is very effective for lots of other individuals, just not these individuals. So how do we do this? Well, we actually created video games. And what these video games do is target the very specific attention and brain abnormalities that I described for you today. So one is called a reversal game, where you start playing and the elephant is winning you a ton of points, but the giraffe is losing you points. And all of a sudden in the middle of the game, the contingency changes, meaning the giraffe starts winning you points and the elephant starts losing you points. You're not told when, you just have to notice the shift. And people with psychopathy usually are pretty bad at this because they have difficulty noticing these contextual cues. We also could play a game where you're supposed to respond to the letters or numbers in the middle, but you don't respond, meaning you withhold a button press if the square or rectangle is yellow. You only respond when it's green. People with psychopathy really struggle to pay attention to both the color and the letter string, just like they have a lot of difficulty integrating the color of the letter with shock and the case of the letter. And then lastly, we could actually play a game that helps focus on emotion. So if you see the eyes looking left, on most trials, you're going to press the left button. And if you see the eyes looking right, you're going to press the right button. But every day you sit down to play the video game, you're told about your target emotion for that day. So today's target emotion is fear. When you see a fear face and the eyes are looking left, you actually press the right button, but only for the fear face. So if you see a happy face and the eyes are looking left, you do what you normally do, press the left button. Again, people with psychopathy usually are bad at this because they really only focus on the first part of the goal, which is the direction of the eye gaze, and they struggle to integrate the emotion on the face. So together, these games take about an hour to play. At the end of each game, people are shown a progress graph of how they do from week to week. So they play the game once a week for 6 weeks in a row. They're told, not that this is a therapy, just that we want you to build some skills, and these games can help you build skills. After each game, if they improve, we say, way to go, you're developing your skills. If they stay the same, we say, keep it up. And if they get worse, we say sometimes it takes a while to develop new skills, good luck next time. All of these games are only supposed to help people with psychopathy. They won't help other people who don't have the types of abnormalities that I described for you. So we can test this in what we call a randomized clinical trial, where we bring people with psychopathy in and we give them this treatment, and then we give them another treatment that's not meant for